This is your Test 3 study guide. If you will follow along in the study guide that I've posted for you in D2L, I will move forward from this slide. The first section, of course, that we went over is the legislative branch. You'll want to start by knowing the characteristics of your two houses of Congress, the House and the Senate. Know how long a term is in the House versus the Senate. Of course, in the Senate we've got 6 years, and in the House we've got 2-year terms. Qualifications, how old do you have to be? How many members are in each? We've got those 435 seats in the House and 100 seats in the Senate. Congressional powers and responsibilities. This was several slides in the legislative branch PowerPoint that talked about not only do they have a responsibility to their constituents, which differs between a senator and a congressman, but you also have the responsibilities of oversight of legislation, public education, casework, and so forth. So make sure you review those slides that talk about congressional powers and responsibilities. Leadership in each House of Congress. You don't need to know the specific names of leadership in the House and leadership in the Senate, but you do need to know this. What are the different positions? For instance, in the House, we've got the Speaker of the House as the most politically important and powerful person in the House of Representatives. And who is that counter person in the Senate? It's not the President of the Senate, which is what we might think it would be. Instead, it's actually the Majority Leader, which we've mentioned in those slides. So you need to know what those different positions do. What does a whip do? What does the Minority Leader do? So look over those slides and make sure that you understand those roles. Furthermore, what is the role of the committee and the subcommittee? Which one's more specific? What do the subcommittees do that the committees don't do? So you need to make sure you review that as well. There are different types of committees. There are standing committees and joint committees. So, and there are also committees that that are not necessarily standing, but are fluid rather in time. So make sure you look at the different types of committees that exist and know the definitions of those, because you're likely to see those come up as a term. How a bill becomes a law. Understand the process and differences between the House and the Senate. As we discussed on the board, really the process is generally the same between the House and the Senate and how a bill becomes a law. It can originate anywhere. It's introduced by a member of the Senate or a member of the House. But there are a couple key differences. For instance, the filibuster only happens in the Senate, and then at some point both of the House and the Senate come together in joint committee called the conference committee. So know that process a little bit. Now, you don't need to know the steps necessarily. What you need to understand is how the process works. In other words, again, what are the roles of the filibuster? What's the role of the committees? Where are the different points that a bill might die in the process of a bill becoming a law? The Commerce Clause of the Constitution. This is one we did not talk about in class necessarily, so make sure you review it in your book and in your slides. The Commerce Clause is the clause of the Constitution that Congress often uses as justification for passing their laws, because they have to have constitutional authority to actually write a bill and pass a bill in Congress in the first place. And oftentimes the constitutional authority that they use is the Commerce Clause. So make sure you look at what that is. Tax bills and appropriation bills. Tax bills or revenue bills must constitutionally originate in the House of Representatives. However, what we often find is that appropriation bills, or giving out money, handing out money, appropriating money, those bills also usually or customarily also originate in the House. Next slide. On the executive branch, again, you want to know the qualifications in terms of the president and vice president, how old they have to be, do they have to be natural born, and how long the president serves, and how many terms the president's allowed to serve. How is the president elected? Again, we've talked about the Electoral College on a number of occasions here, so you should sort of understand that process by now. And the order of succession, of course, it's the president, and then if something happens to the president, it's the vice president, followed by the Speaker of the House, and so on. So know that order of succession. the roles of the president. You'll see some sort of examples on the test of the roles of the president, so make sure you sort of review those and know what it means to be a head of state, what it means to be a commander-in-chief. Influence and powers. This is the influence of appointment and removal in particular. You want to make sure that you know the functions of the executive appointment and removal. In other words, what is it that makes appointment and removal so powerful, so important in the executive branch? Executive judicial functions as well. So there's a slide that talks about the fact that the president can commute a sentence, can provide amnesty or clemency of a sentence. So you want to make sure you know all of those. And what kinds of cases are those going to happen on? Are they going to be on state level cases, low level cases? No, often the president is commuting a sentence for someone who is at a very high level or in a very high level federal case. And then finally, veto power. Now the president does, yes, have the power to veto a bill, but what are the ideas of a pocket veto? Or what happens after 10 days if he doesn't sign? Does it become law? Does it veto? Make sure you understand all of the veto powers the president has as well. The executive bureaucracy. Make sure you know how to define bureaucracy. These are the organizations that implement the law. They are the doers in our federal government. So make sure you understand that basic definition. Be able to identify the differences between the executive office of the president, the cabinet, the independent agencies and regulatory commissions, and the government corporations. So for instance, if I asked you who are the main advisors to the president, would you say the cabinet? If you did, you would be wrong, because those are not the core everyday advisors to the president. It is within the executive office of the president that we find the key advisors. Of course, the executive office is also headed up by the White House Chief of Staff. And the main role of this office, again, is to advise the president on a day-to-day basis. Now, the cabinet is his much larger organization. That's all your secretaries of whatever and the department of whatever. So your Secretary of State, your Secretary of Energy, your Secretary of Defense, so on and so forth. They all head up the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and they make up the president's cabinet. Now, that's a much larger organization, and they are not necessarily, though they are advisors to the president, not the day-to-day key advisors. They're not the inner circle. The independent agencies and regulatory commissions, we talked about what makes them, quote, independent, and you need to know what makes them quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative. And then finally, government corporations. That was a fairly straightforward definition, but you should also know what a good example of a government corporation is. Knowing the basic characteristics of each of the bureaucratic sectors. Again, we sort of just reviewed that in this last section. Issues of the bureaucracy and for the bureaucracy. That was the last two slides in this lecture, and it talks about some of these pros and cons of the bureaucratic system. In other words, what are the things that people criticize the bureaucratic system for? Of course, it's criticized for being very, very large, for having a lot of red tape, very difficult to navigate. It's been criticized for the agency capture issue, which is what happens when an independent agency or regulatory commission gets very close to, for instance, an interest group who they may work very closely with. For instance, let's say the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, might work very closely with the National Wildlife Federation. And what can happen is, instead of implementing the law, what happens is that independent agency now begins to move forward the agenda of that interest group instead, and that's called agency capture. So you want to make sure you understand that concept. Next slide. Finally, we had the judicial branch. This is going to be a lot of terms that you're going to need to learn the definitions of. So what are the different types of law? We've got the criminal and civil law. What are the different branches of American law? We've got common law, equity, statutory law, administrative law, and constitutional law. Make sure you understand where all of those laws originate. For instance, statutory law comes out of our legislatures. Administrative law comes out of our regulatory commissions. Constitutional law clearly comes out of the Constitution. How do we get common law? That comes from decisions from judges after wrongdoings have happened. So make sure you understand where all of these laws generate from. Jurisdiction, if I am a court, I of course am going to have a certain jurisdiction, so you need to know how each of those jurisdictions operate. Do I have original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction? Do I have geographical jurisdiction? Do I have general jurisdiction or special jurisdiction? And what do all of these mean? Standing. If I want to bring a case to the courts, I need to have standing in that case. So what does that mean to have standing? An injunction, this of course is tied to the branch of law called equity. And in equity, if we want to prevent something from happening in the first place, we'll ask the courts to file an injunction, which is going to stop a wrongdoing from happening in the first place. The state court system. As we saw on the board the other day, the state court system is a little bit more in-depth than the federal court system. We have a lot of different types of courts in this system. In our trial courts, we might have magistrate courts, we might have special jurisdiction courts, and we might have circuit courts. What are each of those court types going to handle? What kinds of cases? They're all trial courts, but they're going to handle different types of cases. So you need to know those three court systems in the state court system. And then of course there are intermediate courts and a Supreme Court of each state. In the federal court system, we have 94 district courts, and these are our trial courts in the U.S. We have 12 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal, and those are our appellate intermediate courts. And then of course we have one Supreme Court, which is our court of last resort. And then characteristics of the U.S. Supreme Court. How many members are there? What is their jurisdiction? Do they have original, appellate, or both? And then finally, what is the concept of judicial review? As you're looking at the Supreme Court, they have a very special kind of jurisdiction and a special kind of power in the Constitution called judicial review. And it's a controversial power which allows them to take a piece of legislation out of Congress, a bill that's become a law, and they can review that law to see if it is constitutional without a case ever making its way to the Supreme Court. So they can sort of look at it originally. And so you need to understand that concept and understand why it's controversial. So that's going to be your test 3. Again, it will be 50 multiple choice true-false questions worth 2 points each. I will not be present for the test, but you will have it proctored by another faculty member. So you can still turn in your extra credit. They'll put that in my mailbox for me, so I will add that to your test grades. Your test grades will not be posted right away because I will be out of town through next weekend. So you will not have your test posted until probably early next week. So that's what you can expect out of test 3, and if you have specific questions, feel free to drop me an email at hfarley@ccga.edu.